The volcanic moon of Keth 7 hung in the darkness of space like a wound that refused to heal. Its surface glowing with rivers of molten rock and skies thick with ash that never settled. And it was here that the Galactic Coalition had built their most prestigious and most feared training facility in the known universe. The Deathworld Survival Academy stood as a monument to suffering, carved directly into the black volcanic stone, its towers reaching toward a sky that crackled with lightning and toxic storms. And every species in the Coalition knew that only the strongest and most capable soldiers could hope to survive its legendary trial. Senior Instructor Vethkra had spent 30 years watching cadets break inside these walls, and she had never once felt sympathy for any of them. For weakness was simply not something she tolerated or understood. She was Sorix, standing nearly 8 feet tall with scales, the color of dry blood, and eyes that glowed like embers in the dim light of the briefing chamber. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 1,000 broken cadets who had failed before. "Welcome to the Academy," she announced to the 47 recruits seated before her, her neck frills extending slightly in what her species used as a display of dominance. "And understand that most of you will not complete this program." The recruits shifted nervously in their seats. A collection of species from across the Coalition who had fought and bled and proven themselves worthy of this opportunity. And yet they all felt small under Vethkra's burning gaze. There were Torvax warriors with their 4 arms and thick leathery skin, Fenari scouts with their delicate frames and massive eyes adapted for darkness, Kethmari soldiers whose bodies could survive the vacuum of space for short periods, and Veloci hunters with scales that changed color with their moods. And then there was the human corporal. Elena Vasquez sat in the 3rd row, looking remarkably ordinary among such exotic company, with her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and her standard-issue uniform fitting her average-size frame. And she appeared to be paying more attention to the bag on her lap than to the intimidating instructor before her. Vethkra's eyes fixed on the human with barely concealed contempt. For she had argued against this admission for months before the Coalition Council had overruled her in the name of diplomatic relations with the newest member species. "Before we begin," Vethkra continued, her claws clicking against the podium as she pulled up a holographic display, "let us discuss why some species are suited for Deathworld survival and why others are not." The display showed various planets and their classifications, ranked from Class 1 paradise worlds to Class 5 extinction-level hellscapes. And the recruits watched with interest as their home worlds appeared with their respective ratings. The Sorix evolved on Keth Prime, a Class 4 world with extreme temperatures and predators that could tear through starship hulls, Vethkra said with obvious pride. "Which is why my people have produced more graduates from this Academy than any other species in Coalition history." She gestured and new data appeared, showing Earth floating serenely in space with its blue oceans and green continents. "And then we have Earth," she said, her tone dripping with dismissal. "Home to our newest Coalition members." Elena looked up from her bag briefly, then returned to whatever she was doing inside it. "Earth is classified as a Class 2 world," Vethkra announced, "which means it presents moderate challenges at best, with survivable temperatures and manageable predators and atmospheric conditions that pose no significant threat." Several recruits turned to look at Elena with expressions ranging from pity to amusement, and a Torvax warrior actually chuckled under his breath. "Humans," Vethkra continued, pulling up biological data on the display, "are soft-skinned creatures with no natural armor or weapons, slow healing capabilities compared to most Coalition species, limited sensory abilities, and physical strength that ranks in the bottom quarter of known sentient beings." Elena had pulled a thermos from her bag and was quietly unscrewing the cap. "They cannot see in darkness like the Fenari, cannot survive temperature extremes like the Sorix, cannot endure high gravity like the Torvax, and cannot regenerate damaged tissue like the Veloci. Vethkra listed each failing with obvious satisfaction, which raises the question of why the Council believed a human could survive training designed to break species far superior to their own. The classroom fell silent as Vethkra stepped down from the podium and walked directly toward Elena, her heavy footsteps echoing through the chamber like the drums of war. "Corporal Vasquez," she said, stopping directly in front of the human seat. "I am offering you an opportunity that I have never offered any cadet before." Elena looked up at the towering reptilian instructor and took a casual sip from her thermos, the steam rising from what appeared to be some kind of soup. "Tomorrow begins the Crucible trial," Vethkra continued, "a 72-hour survival simulation that has broken cadets from every species in this room. And I am giving you the chance to withdraw now, with your dignity intact rather than being carried out on a medical stretcher." The other recruits held their breath, waiting to see how the small human would respond to this unprecedented display of what Vethkra probably considered mercy. Elena swallowed her soup and looked thoughtfully at the instructor for a moment. "What time do we start tomorrow?" she asked, her voice calm and genuinely curious. Vethkra's neck frills flared with irritation, and her scales shifted to a darker shade of red that indicated anger in her. "Species 0600 standard hours," she replied through clenched teeth. "Great," Elena said with a small nod. "That gives me time to pack a lunch." She returned to her soup while Vethkra stood frozen in disbelief, her claws twitching with the urge to shake some understanding into this foolish creature who clearly did not comprehend the danger she faced. "Very well," Vethkra finally said, turning sharply and marching back to the podium. "Let it be recorded that the human was offered withdrawal and refused. And let no one say I did not give her the chance to preserve her fragile body." The briefing continued for another hour as Vethkra outlined the basics of the train program. But Elena seemed more interested in the bread and apple she had produced from her bag than in the feigen and the instructor's warnings about extreme temperatures and toxic atmospheres and simulated predators. When the briefing ended and the recruits filed out of the chamber, a young Fenari cadet with silver-white fur approached Elena with concern in their large dark eyes. "Are you not frightened?" they asked in a whispered voice. Elena finished her apple and tossed the core into a waste receptacle with practiced ease. "I learned a long time ago that being scared does not fill your stomach," she replied with a friendly smile. "And whatever happens tomorrow, I plan to face it with a full belly." The Fenari watched the strange human walk away toward the cadet barracks, unsure whether they had just witnessed incredible bravery or complete madness. In her office high above the briefing chamber, Vethkra stood at her window, watching the volcanic storms rage across the horizon, and felt something she had not experienced in many years. It was not doubt exactly, but rather a small crack in her absolute certainty. And she did not like it at all. Tomorrow would prove her right, she told herself. For tomorrow, the Crucible would break the human, just as it had broken so many others before her. Tomorrow would show the entire coalition why some species were simply not built for survival. She was certain of it. The Crucible chamber was a marvel of coalition engineering, a massive dome that stretched nearly a kilometer across and contained technology capable of recreating the conditions of any planet in the known galaxy. Cross stood in the observation deck high above the chamber floor, her claws resting on the control console as she watched the 47 recruits gather at the entrance below. And a cold satisfaction filled her ancient heart. Today she would teach them all what true survival meant. And today the human would learn that some lessons could not be eaten. Scenario Theta 9. She commanded the computer. Gravity at 1.4 standard. Atmospheric pressure doubled. Temperature cycling between extremes. And activate toxic gas vents at random intervals. The chamber hummed to life around the recruits as the massive doors sealed behind them. And immediately, the air grew thick and heavy as the pressure increased. Elena Vasquez walked into the chamber wearing her standard survival gear and carrying a small pack over her shoulder. And several of the other recruits noticed that she had brought the same bag from yesterday's briefing. "Is that food in there?" A Torvax warrior named Grath demanded with disbelief. "We are about to face the most difficult trial of our lives, and you brought snacks?" Elena shrugged and adjusted the straps of her pack. "I get cranky when I am hungry," she explained simply before Grath could respond. The first temperature shift hit them like a wave, the air suddenly becoming so hot that several recruits gasped and stumbled backward. The Veloci cadets immediately began struggling as their cold-blooded bodies tried desperately to regulate against the sudden extreme heat. And within the first hour, 3 of them had to be evacuated by medical teams, who rushed in through emergency portals. Vethra watched with grim satisfaction from above. Marking each failure in her mental record, the Kethmari were next to fall. Their bodies evolved for low-gravity environments, now being crushed by the increased gravitational pressure. And one by one they collapsed to their knees and triggered their emergency beacons. By midday, only 31 recruits remained active in the chamber. And Vethkra's eyes kept returning to the human with growing irritation. Elena had found a stable rock formation near the center of the chamber and had settled herself against it in a comfortable sitting position. And she was eating what appeared to be a sandwich. "Increase magnification on the human," Vethkra ordered. And the observation screen zoomed in on Elena's position. The human was not gasping or struggling or showing any signs of distress at all. And she appeared to be enjoying her meal, as if she were sitting in a park on a pleasant afternoon, rather than enduring conditions designed to break elite soldiers. "This is impossible," Vethkra muttered under her breath around Elena. The other surviving recruits were pushing themselves to their limits, their bodies straining against the pressure and heat as they forced themselves to keep moving and stay active. The Fenari cadet from yesterday, whose name was Kira, had managed to find shelter near Elena's position and was watching the human with a mixture of exhaustion and amazement. "How are you doing that?" Kira asked between labored breaths. "How are you just sitting there?" Elena offered the Fenari a piece of fruit from her pack. "Doing what?" she asked, genuinely confused. "Not dying," Kira exclaimed. Elena considered this for a moment while chewing. "The gravity is a little heavy, I suppose," she admitted. "But honestly, I have felt worse after a length day at the gym back home." Vethkra's claws dug into the console as she listened to the audio feed from the chamber. And her scales had shifted to an angry purple that made the junior instructors keep their distance. "She is mocking me," Vethkra hissed. She must be hiding her suffering to make a point. She reached for the temperature controls and pushed them 15 degrees higher than the scenario specifications allowed, while beyond what even a Sarix would consider comfortable. In the chamber below, several more recruits collapsed immediately from the sudden spike in heat, and medical teams rushed to evacuate them before permanent damage occurred. Elena paused in her eating and looked up at the ceiling with mild annoyance. "Getting a bit warm," she said to no one in particular. She removed her outer jacket and tied it around her waist, then took a long drink from her water bottle and continued eating her sandwich. Vethra stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. 26 recruits remained now, and the day was only half finished. And the human was having lunch. Senior instructor, a nervous junior officer, approached carefully. "The temperature is exceeding safety parameters for several of the remaining species." "I am aware," Vethkra replied without looking away from Elena. "Should we reduce it to standard levels?" "No." The junior officer wisely decided to say nothing more and retreated to a safe distance as the hours passed and the temperature cycling continued between scorching heat and bitter cold. More recruits fell to the relentless assault on their bodies. The Torvax warrior Grath lasted longer than most, his forearms and thick hide serving him well. But even he eventually succumbed to the accumulated stress and had to be evacuated with severe dehydration by the end of day one. Only 19 recruits remained standing, and Elena Vasquez was one of them. She had finished her sandwich hours ago and had moved on to some kind of dried meat snack, which she shared with Kira the Fenari, who had somehow managed to survive by staying close to the inexplicably comfortable human. The human should have fallen by now, Vethkra said to herself as she reviewed the day's data in her private quarters that evening. Every projection showed she would be among the first casualties. She pulled up Elena's biological file and began reading more carefully than she had before, searching for some explanation for what she had witnessed. The file contained standard information about human physiology and evolution, but one section caught her attention: persistence predation. Vethkra read aloud. A hunting strategy in which humans would pursue prey across vast distances over extended periods until the target animal collapsed from exhaustion. She continued reading about how humans had evolved on a planet where they were neither the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most armored, and how they had survived by simply refusing to stop. Humans do not need to be superior in any single category, the file explained, because their advantage lies in their ability to endure conditions that would force other species to stop and rest. Vethkra sat back in her chair and felt that small crack of doubt from yesterday grow slightly wider. She looked at the classification data for Earth and frowned at the Class 2 rating that she had quoted so confidently in yesterday's briefing. Computer, she said slowly, show me the full environmental analysis for the planet designated Earth. The data that appeared on her screen made her scales pale to a sickly gray. Earth had temperature extremes that rivaled Sorik's homeworlds in some regions, and the planet experienced regular natural disasters, including massive storms and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The atmosphere contained a highly reactive gas called oxygen that was toxic to many species, and the surface was bombarded by radiation from the local star that would cause cellular damage to most coalition races. This is a Class 4 world at minimum, Vethkra whispered with growing horror. Who authorized a Class 2 rating? She thought about Elena sitting calmly in the chamber eating a lunch while conditions around her broke soldiers from supposedly superior species. And for the first time in 30 years, Vethkra wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, but she pushed that thought aside and straightened her shoulders with renewed determination. Tomorrow, she would increase the difficulty even further. And tomorrow the human would finally break like all the others before her. She was certain of it. She had to be. Day 2 began with Vethkra arriving at the observation deck before dawn, her eyes burning with a determination that made the night shift officers quickly find reasons to be elsewhere. She had spent the sleepless night studying human biology and Earth's environmental data, and what she had learned had shaken something deep inside her that she refused to acknowledge. New parameters for today, she announced to the computer with cold precision. Add seismic activity at random intervals, reduce oxygen content by 15%, and release the pain insects. The junior instructor who had spoken up yesterday stepped forward with obvious concern. Senior instructor, the pain insects have not been used in standard training for over a decade because of the psychological damage they cause. This is not standard training, Vethkra replied without emotion. This is a test. The chamber floor began to shake as the first tremor rolled through, and the 19 surviving recruits scrambled to find stable ground. Elena had been doing light stretches when the quake hit, and she simply widened her stance and rode out the shaking like someone who had experienced such things many times before. Earthquakes, she muttered to herself with something that almost sounded like nostalgia. Reminds me of home. Kira the Fenari had attached herself to Alana's group overnight. Recognizing that the humans seemed to possess some inexplicable ability to remain comfortable in conditions that were slowly killing everyone else. "Your planet has ground shaking?" Kira asked with horror. "All the time in some places." Elena confirmed while checking that her food pack had survived the tremor intact. "I grew up in a region called California, where we had them pretty regularly. And you just lived there anyway?" The weather was nice. Kira stared at the human with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering everything she thought. She knew about the galaxy. The pain insects were released an hour later. Swarms of tiny creatures engineered to deliver bites that triggered extreme pain responses in most nervous systems, without causing permanent physical damage within. Minutes, the air was filled with screaming as recruits from various species were overwhelmed by the assault. Their bodies reacting to pain signals that their minds could not overcome. More recruits were evacuated with what the medical teams called acute sensory. Elena swatted at the insects with her hand like they were minor annoyances. And when one landed on her arm and bit her, she simply flicked it away and continued walking. "Do these things not hurt you?" Kira demanded while desperately trying to cover her exposed fur. "They sting a little," Elena admitted. "But honestly, I have been bitten by worse mosquitoes during camping trips." She reached into her pack and pulled out a small container of leftover pasta that she had apparently prepared the night before. "Want some?" She offered to Kira. The Fenari was too busy trying not to scream from insect bites to respond up. In the observation deck, Vethkra watched the human eat cold pasta while insects swarmed around her. And the senior instructor felt something cracking inside her. Certainty that she could no longer ignore. Pull up the human's pain tolerance data. She commanded the information. That appeared showed that humans had evolved in remarkable ability to suppress and manage pain through conscious effort. A survival adaptation that allowed them to continue functioning even with severe injuries. They also produce natural chemicals called endorphins during stress that reduce pain perception, the computer explained. And human cultural practices often include deliberate exposure to discomfort as a form of training or recreation. Recreation? Vethkra repeated with disbelief. Affirmative. Humans engage in voluntary activities, such as consuming capsaicin-rich foods that trigger pain responses, exposing themselves to extreme temperatures in structures called saunas, and participating in physical competitions that result in significant bodily damage. They hurt themselves for fun? That appears to be accurate. Senior Instructor Vethkra turned back to the observation screen where Elena was now jogging lightly around the chamber to stay warm during a cold cycle. The insects seeming to have given up on her in favor of easier targets. Another tremor hit, and the human simply adjusted her stride without breaking pace. Continuing her light jog while eating pasta with a small fork. "This does not make sense," Vethkra said to no one in particular. No species should be able to adapt to this many variables simultaneously. A junior instructor named Kethrol, who had been quietly monitoring the data, approached with a tablet in his clawed hands. Senior Instructor, "I have been reviewing the Earth classification files, and I believe there may have been an error in the original assessment. Show me." Vethkra demanded. Kethrol pulled up the data with trembling claws. Earth was originally surveyed by an automated probe that measured only physical parameters, he explained. But it did not account for the cumulative effect of the planet's challenges. The screen showed a list that made Vethkra's scales shift to an uncomfortable gray extreme. Temperature variance across regions, with some areas experiencing temperature swings of over 50 degrees in a single day regular seismic activity. Volcanic eruptions and massive storms capable of destroying entire settlements. Predators on every continent, including several species of large carnivores and countless venomous creatures. A highly reactive atmosphere that caused oxidative damage to most materials over time. high levels of solar radiation that required biological adaptations to survive parasites and pathogens so numerous and adaptable that humans had developed an entire field of science just to combat them. When calculated properly, Cathrall concluded nervously, Earth qualifies as a Class 4 Deathworld, the same classification as our own training facility. Vethkra stood in silence for a long moment, watching Elena share her pasta with a grateful Kira, who had finally managed to find shelter from the insects. The humans did not need to build a training facility to learn survival, Vethkra said slowly as understanding began to dawn, because they were born on one. By the end of day 2, only 11 recruits remained in the Crucible. 2 of them were Sorcs, the pride of Vethkra's own species and her best hope for maintaining a record of superior graduate state, were a mixture of other species who had proven exceptionally resilient, and one was Elena Vasquez, who had somehow found time to take a short nap during the afternoon while chaos reigned around her. She is not just surviving, Vethkra admitted to herself in the privacy of her quarters that night. She is comfortable. The thought kept her awake for hours as she stared at the ceiling and wondered how she could have been so wrong about an entire species. But pride was a powerful force, and Vethkra had built her reputation on being right about the limits of weakness. Tomorrow would be the final day of the Crucible, and tomorrow she would push the simulation beyond anything these recruits had faced before. If the human could survive that, then Vethkra would have no choice but to accept a truth that challenged everything she believed. She found herself almost hoping that Elena would prove her wrong almost. The final day of the Crucible dawned with an ominous silence that made even the veteran instructors exchange worried glances. Vethkra had arrived at the observation deck with dark circles under her eyes and a look of grim determination that suggested she had made peace with whatever was about to happen. Full Deathworld simulation, she commanded the computer. Predator drones at maximum aggression. Flash flood protocols, atmospheric lightning, and radiation bursts at near-lethal levels. The junior instructor, Cathrall, stepped forward with obvious alarm. Senior instructor, those parameters exceed standard training limitations by a significant margin. I am aware. Several of those settings have never been combined before because the interaction effects are unpredictable. Then we will learn something new today, Vethkra replied with a voice like grinding stone. Either about the limits of our equipment or the limits of our recruits. The 11 remaining cadets stood at the center of the chamber as the environment around them transformed into something that resembled a nightmare. Made real dark clouds form near the ceiling and began crackling with electrical energy, while the ground trembled with the approach of simulated floodwaters from hidden reservoirs. Predator drones emerged from concealed ports in the walls, their mechanical bodies designed to mimic the hunting patterns of the deadliest creatures in Coalition space. Elena looked up at the gathering storm and then down at her pack, doing a quick mental inventory of her remaining supplies. Should have brought more snacks, she muttered. The first lightning strike hit the ground less than 10 meters from the group of recruits, and the explosion of energy sent several of them tumbling backward. A Fenari cadet who was not. Kira triggered their emergency beacon immediately, unable to face what was clearly going to be a brutal final trial. 10 remained. The floodwaters came next, rushing through channels in the chamber floor with enough force to sweep unprepared recruits off their feet. Elena grabbed Kira by the arm and pulled her toward higher ground, her human instincts reading the water patterns with an ease that came from evolving on a planet where floods were just another Tuesday. Stay close to me, Elena shouted over the roaring water. And keep your head up. The Predator drones attacked during the chaos of the flood, their targeting systems identifying struggling recruits as easy prey. One of the Sorcs warriors, a female named Vreth, who had been performing exceptionally well, was hit by 3 drones. Simultaneously, while trying to cross a flooded section of the chamber, her emergency beacon activated as the medical team rushed to extract. Her 9 remained. Elena found a rocky outcropping that offered some protection from both the water and the lightning, and she helped Kira climb to safety before turning to face an approaching drone. "Come on then," she said to the machine with a tone that suggested mild irritation. Rather than fear, the drone lunged at her with mechanical claws extended, and Elena sidestepped its attack with a fluid motion that spoke of training and experience. Then grabbed its sensor array and slammed it against the rock. The drone sparked and fell, disabled by damage to its primary targeting system. Another drone approached, and Elena picked up a piece of debris from the ground, hurling it with surprising accuracy to strike the machine's propulsion unit and send it spinning out of control. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Kira asked with amazement. "My older brothers," Elena replied while scanning for more threats. "They did not believe in going easy on me." The radiation burst began next. Invisible waves of energy that triggered warning alarms on every recruit's survival suit. Most species would begin experiencing cellular damage within minutes of exposure at these levels, and the medical team stood ready to extract anyone whose readings approached dangerous thresholds. 4 more recruits fell over the next 2 hours, their bodies simply unable to handle the combined assault of flooding, lightning, drones, and radiation. 5 remained, and Elena was still among them, the last Saurix warrior, a massive male named Threk, who had been one of Vethkra's personal selections for the program, finally collapsed near the end of the second hour. His scales had turned a sickly pale color, and his body was shaking with exhaustion and accumulated stress fractures from the high gravity. "I cannot continue," he admitted with shame in his voice as his beacon activated. 4 remained. Elena was moving across the chamber toward a better defensive position when a lightning strike hit the ground directly beside her, and the electrical discharge caught her shoulder in a blast of searing energy. She grunted in pain and stumbled, her hand going to the burned flesh where her suit had failed to provide adequate protection. Kira screamed and rushed toward her, but Elena held up her other hand to stop the Fanari. "I am fine," she said through gritted teeth. "It is just a burn." "Just a burn?" Kira repeated with disbelief. "Your flesh is smoking." Elena looked at her shoulder and shrugged with her good arm. "I have had worse sunburns." She pulled a small medical kit from her pack and applied a quick bandage to the wound, her movements practiced and efficient despite the obvious pain. Then she reached into her pack and pulled out a slightly crushed protein bar. "Are you seriously going to eat right now?" Kira demanded. "Especially right now," Elena replied while unwrapping the bar with one hand. "My body needs fuel to heal." Up in the observation deck, Vethkra watched the human eat a protein bar while treating her own lightning burn. And something inside the senior instructor finally broke. It was not doubt anymore, and it was not uncertainty. It was recognition. She was watching a Deathworlder in their natural state, and she had been too blind to see it from the beginning. "End the simulation?" she commanded quietly. "Senior instructor?" Cathrall asked with confusion. "End it now," Vethkra repeated. "And send full medical teams immediately." The storms faded and the water drained away, and the drones returned to their ports, leaving the 4 surviving recruits standing in the sudden silence of the chamber. Elena looked around at the retreating chaos and then down at her half-eaten protein bar. "That is it?" she asked with what sounded almost like disappointment. Kira collapsed to the ground beside her, sobbing with relief and exhaustion when the chamber doors opened and the medical teams rushed in. Elena walked out under her own power while supporting Kira with her uninjured arm. Vethkra was waiting for them, standing at the exit with an expression that none of the junior instructors had ever seen on her face before. It was something that looked almost like respect. "Corporal," Vasquez, the senior instructor said as Elena approached. Report to the medical bay for treatment of your injuries. Elena nodded and started walking, then paused and turned back. Is there time to grab real food before the debrief? She asked. I only packed snacks for 3 days, and I could really use an actual meal. Bethkris stared at the human for a long moment. This small, soft creature, who had just survived conditions designed to break the strongest soldiers in Coalition space. Take all the time you need, she finally replied. Elena smiled and continued toward the medical bay, still supporting Kira with one arm, while her burned shoulder smoked slightly in the cool. Erthakra watched her go and felt 30 years of certainty crumble into dust she had been wrong about. Human, she had been completely and utterly wrong. 1 week had passed since the Crucible ended, and the Academy had not stopped talking about what had happened. Rumors spread through the halls like wildfire, growing more exaggerated with each telling until the stories bore little resemblance to reality. Some said the human had killed 20 drones with her bare hands, while others claimed she had walked through lightning without flinching, and a few insisted that she had actually fallen asleep during the final trial. The truth was somehow more impressive than any of the rumors. Elena Vasquez had achieved the highest survival scores recorded in the Crucible in over 15 years, and she had done it while treating the entire experience like a mildly inconvenient camping trip. The formal assembly hall was packed with cadets and instructors from across the Academy, all gathered to witness the official results ceremony for the latest Crucible class. Elena sat in the front row with her shoulder still bandaged but healing quickly, and beside her was Kira, the Fanari who had become something like a permanent companion since the trials ended. I still do not understand how you did it, Kira whispered as they waited for the ceremony to begin. I watched you the entire time, and I still do not understand. Elena shrugged with her good shoulder. I just did what felt natural, she replied. Nothing special, really. Kira made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been despair. You ate lunch while lightning struck around you, and call that nothing special. I was hungry. Before Kira could respond, the assembly fell silent as senior instructor Vethkra emerged from a side entrance and walked to the podium at the front of the hall. The Vodian towering Sarx looked different somehow, though it took most observers a moment to identify what had changed. Scales had lost their aggressive dark red coloring and had shifted to something closer to neutral gray, and her neck frills lay flat against her shoulders in a posture that indicated humility rather than dominance. 1 week ago, Vethkra began, her voice carrying through the silent hall. 47 recruits entered the Crucible trial, and only 4 survived to its completion. She paused and looked directly at Elena in the front row. This is the lowest completion rate in nearly a decade, and many of you might assume that this reflects poorly on the quality of this year's candidates. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. You would be wrong, Vethkra continued, because this year I made a decision to push the Crucible beyond standard parameters, to test a theory about the limits of survival. She activated a holographic display behind her that showed the prestige final rankings of all recruits. Elena's name sat at the very top of the list with scores that made several senior instructors gasp. Audibly, Corporal Elena Vasquez of Earth achieved results that challenged everything I believed I knew about species, classification, and survival capability, Vethkra announced. And in doing so, she exposed a fundamental error in how the Coalition has categorized her. Homeworld. The display shifted to show Earth's data, but this time with new classification markers. I have formally submitted a request to the Coalition Science Council to reclassify Earth from a Class 2 moderate world to a Class 4 death world, Vethkra said, and I have included evidence from Corporal Vasquez's performance to support this request. Shocked whispers filled the hall as aliens from various species tried to process what they were. Hearing a Class 4 Deathworld was the same rating as Keth 7 itself, the same as the Sarik's homeworld. And the idea that humans came from such a planet seemed impossible to those who only saw their soft skin and friendly smiles. I have spent 30 years teaching soldiers that survival requires superior physical traits. Vethkra continued, her voice heavy with something that sounded almost like shame. And I was wrong. She stepped down from the podium and walked toward Elena, stopping directly in front of the seated human. Humans are not weak, she said loud enough for the entire hall to hear. They are Deathworlders who learn to hide their lethality behind adaptability and persistence. Elena looked up at the massive reptilian instructor who had once dismissed her entire species as fragile. They do not need claws or armor or regeneration because they evolved something far more dangerous. Vethkra announced, they evolved the ability to simply refuse to die. The hall was absolutely silent. Corporal Vasquez, Vethkra said formally, I am offering you a position not as a cadet but as an assistant instructor at this academy. Elena's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. The coalition needs to understand what humans truly are. Vethkra explained, and I believe you can help teach them. Elena considered the offer for a moment, and then a small smile crossed her face. I accept, she said, but I have one condition. Name it. Lunch breaks remain sacred, Elena replied with absolute seriousness. No interruptions and no exceptions. Vethkra's neck frills twitched in what might have been the Sorik's equivalent of a laugh. Agreed. The assembly dissolved into excited conversation as news of what had just happened spread through the crowd. And Elena found herself surrounded by curious aliens who wanted to know more about the Deathworld called Earth. Later that evening, Elena sat alone in the academy cafeteria, enjoying a proper meal for the first time in days and savoring the simple pleasure of hot food and quiet surroundings. The chair across from her scraped against the floor as someone sat down, and she looked up to find Vethkra settling her massive frame into a seat that was clearly not designed for Sorik's proportions. I wanted to apologize, the senior instructor said without preamble, for my behavior at the beginning of the program. Elena paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. You were not wrong about human physical capabilities, she said after a moment. We really are soft and slow compared to most species, but I was wrong about what that meant, Vethkra admitted. I assumed that physical weakness indicated overall weakness, and I could not have been more mistaken. She placed a small container on the table that she had been carrying. One of the Torvax instructors told me that humans enjoy something called curry, she said awkwardly. And I wanted to try understanding your species better by experiencing your food. Elena grinned and pushed the container toward Vethkra. That is very spicy for most non-humans, she warned. You might want to start with something milder. Vethkra made a dismissive sound and opened the container, spooning a generous portion into her mouth with typical Sarik's overconfidence. Her scales immediately shifted to a brilliant orange color that Elena had never seen before, and the senior instructor's eyes went wide with shock. Water, Vethkra gasped. I need water immediately. Elena laughed and handed over a piece of bread from her own tray. Bread helps more than water, she advised. It absorbs the capsaicin. Vethkra grabbed the bread and shoved it into her mouth, chewing desperately while her scales slowly returned to their normal coloring. Humans eat this for pleasure? She demanded when she could finally speak again. Sometimes we add more spice. Elena confirmed with a grin. Vethkra stared at her with an expression that combined horror and grudging admiration in equal measure. Your species is genuinely terrifying, she said. We just like flavor. Elena replied with a shrug. They sat together in the cafeteria as the artificial night fell over the academy. Two Deathworlders from opposite ends of the galaxy, sharing a meal and beginning what would become an unlikely friendship across the room, a group of new cadets watched the scene with amazement, whispering among themselves about the human who had conquered the crucible while eating lunch. One of them, a young Veloci who had just arrived for the next training cycle, asked a question that would be repeated many times in the years to come. Is it true that she never stopped eating? A Fenari cadet with silver-white fur smiled knowingly. Not even once, Kira confirmed. Not even when the lightning hit her. The legend of Elena Vasquez had begun. And across the coalition species, everywhere would learn a new truth about the soft-skinned creatures from the Class 4 Deathworld called Earth. They were never the prey. They had always been the predators, and they preferred to hunt on a full stomach.